During the next decade or so, this infant institution matured into a collection of 3,000 volumes. Then, in the War of 1812, catastrophe struck. First, an American military expedition raided the capital of British-controlled Upper Canada and put its Parliament building, which happened to include the Parliamentary Library, to the torch. Intent on revenge, a British force of 4,000 men invaded Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1814. As President Madison and his colleagues fled into the countryside, the enemy set fire to the White House and other public buildings, including the Capitol, in which the Congressional Library was housed. Nearly all of its precious contents were destroyed. Outraged at what he called these devastations of British vandalism, Thomas Jefferson, by then retired and living in Monticello, promptly offered his own library of nearly 6,500 volumes as a replacement. The United States government accepted and paid him $23,950, not a bad sum in those days, but probably not as much as the collection was worth, for what its owner proudly described as the choicest collection of books in the nation. By one noble stroke, the Library of Congress rose from its ashes in doubled size and acquired a breadth of holdings that foretold its emergence as a truly national library. Even then, the aging bibliophile of the Blue Ridge was not done. No sooner had he parted with the cherished fruit of 45 years of devoted book collecting than Jefferson, although heavily in debt, began to assemble another library in its place. By the time of his death, barely a decade later, it embraced nearly 1,000 volumes. More amazingly still, in these final years of his life, Jefferson labored without stint to establish the University of Virginia and to design the repository of written knowledge that would be its crucial foundation. Not only did he personally select the university's first library, 6,680 separate volumes, he also classified every single one of them and drew up the regulations for their use. His classification scheme endured for more than 80 years. I would not want you to conclude from all this that the Founding Fathers were somehow denizens of an ivory tower, bloody-minded intellectuals given to abstract doctrinaire speculation. They were, as I said earlier, practical men of affairs. As John Dickinson told his fellow delegates in Independence Hall in the sweltering summer of 1787, experience must be our only guide. Reason may mislead us. But, and the historian Douglas Adair made this point years ago, the experience which Dickinson and his confreres brought to bear upon their deliberations was not simply their personal experience, rich and instructive though that was. It was the accumulated experience of past ages derived from books. The past was real to them. It mattered. Their respect for what it could teach them was profound. Gazing back upon these men now from the perspective of 2 centuries plus 20, what are we to make of them today? Viewing them anew through their writings, I cannot but marvel at how different their world was from our own. They lived in a nation of barely 3 million souls, 1/100th of our current population. And of those 3 million or so, the vast majority were farmers. No cell phones, no internet, no email, no blogosphere bound them in instant embrace. No automobiles, no trains, no buses, no shuttle jets transported them swiftly from place to place. In the 1770s and 1780s, it took as long as 6 weeks for a letter to make its way from Philadelphia to London. Theirs was a less cluttered existence. Theirs really the last era before the onset of the age of specialization. In 1787, It was possible for a single individual to encompass in a personal library of a few thousand titles most of the world's important store of knowledge. Today, we live in an era in which more than 170,000 separate books are published in English each year, along with literally thousands of periodicals. The generation of the founders differs from ours in another respect. Unlike ourselves, their distant and often uncomprehending legatees, Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and the rest had to struggle both physically and intellectually to create a free and independent polity. Many of them lost their fortunes and some their lives in the war for liberty. Remember, too, no other republic in history had ever survived very long or had successfully established itself over such a vast expanse of territory. It was not hyperbole for the founders to fear that if their experiment in government making failed, the cause of republicanism, as opposed to monarchism or tyranny, would be discredited forever. It was not hyperbole for James Wilson, a signer of the Constitution, to tell the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention that on the success of the struggle America has made for freedom will depend the exertion of the brave and enlightened of all nations. They were very self-conscious about this. As men who had endured both war and revolution, the framers of the Constitution had to grapple with the consequences of their deeds. For better or for worse, we do not have to preoccupy ourselves with the issues that so perplexed them. Their very success has freed us, like Adams's grandchildren, for other endeavors. Yet if the Founding Fathers were inhabitants of a world that now seems long ago and far away, they nevertheless continue to hold more than antiquarian interest for us. Like Cato for George Washington, they challenge us with the power of their example and their searching commitment to the cause we too profess to hold dear. James Madison once remarked, in words now inscribed on the front of the Madison Building in the Library of Congress, "What spectacle could be more edifying or more seasonable than that of liberty and learning, each leaning on the other for their mutual and surest support?" Liberty and learning. The founders believed earnestly that each required the other if either was to survive. In our ever-accelerating information age, dominated by the computer, the imagery of television and movies, and the pervasiveness of musical sound, an age packed with fact, yet increasingly devoid of cultural literacy, we can still derive inspiration from the 55 framers of the Constitution and their contemporaries who read, collected, used, and created books. Through books, they sought both knowledge and self-knowledge, the means by which better to live. For them, books were not irrelevancies, but bulwarks against barbarism and tyranny. "I cannot live without books," said Jefferson, "and neither, as a civilized people, can we." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nash, for a very enlightening, interesting tour of the founding era. I think your research, your scholarship in this befits the subjects that you talked about. I think you're very much in the spirit of their own vast learning. Dr. Nash is willing to take your questions. If you have a question or two, we have a little bit of time. So please.